Hands up, anyone who want to start? At least half of you. Awesome. I'll start anyway. Yes, I'm not going to talk about why you do monitoring wrong. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I do monitoring wrong. And this sort of stems from the whole Nagios fork community. So anyone who's using real monitoring tools, feel free to pop into the other session. This is just for the people who are using Nagios, Nysinga, and Neiman, and, well, whatever fork you're using. And I, as people probably have noticed before, am not a big fan of the whole Nagios thing. But first of all, kind of a few words about me. I'm a developer, which means that I'm not like you. I don't monitor for the sake of things running. I monitor because I have to. And the reason I have to is because the ops people never want to monitor my things. I go to them and say, hey, can we do this and this and this? And they always tell me, no. We monitor disk, CPU, and memory. And that's it. And I always end up building my own monitoring solution because I still need to monitor my applications. And of course, this is a bit frustrating. But now we have this DevOps thing, right, which will solve all of this for us. Unfortunately, I work with enterprise applications, and they haven't even gone agile yet. You know, so DevOps, that's like 25 years from now. But I do what I can. And for most of you, now's the time for a bit of a nap. I'll be talking a little bit about NSClient I, because I want to sell it a little bit at least while I'm here. So feel free to nap off. I'll tell you when I'm done, and you can wake up later on. First of all, those who saw this last year, this is exactly the same slide. So this is, in essence, last year's presentation, slightly faster. So it's an agent. It's been around for quite some time. It runs on Windows and Linux, and it's modular. It's open source. And this is the big one, not open core yet. And of course, it's really, really sucks. But let's not go there. Yes, 041, click the thing is working sometimes, not always. I wonder if it's not just me and or you and your batteries. I think it's the clickety things that are not working. Anyway, 041 is stable. This means that if you're using anything else, stop now. And yeah, switch to my other clickety thing and see if it works better. No, this just sucks. 042 has been released, and this causes a bit of confusion for people because this means that it is just as stable as 041. The only difference is that it has a lot of changes that may impact your monitoring. So if you think you can just do a drop-in replacement on your 45,000 computers, you're wrong. But if you need anything that 042 has, please use it. It's just as stable, but you might have to tweak your monitoring, and existing things will not always work. Yes. That said, though, what 042 added was, of course, modern Windows support. We had some real-time monitoring, simplified monitoring, Linux checks, and clients. Yes, awesome. We also had a couple of new checks. OS version process is much, much better. We can check page files. And the sort of key takeaway here is we're not using performance data helpers. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's just terrible, terrible, terrible. And I hate it. It has probably spent more time fixing performance data helper bugs than I have spent writing the actual agent. Nowadays, we don't use them anymore. You can use them if you want, and if they don't work, go complain to Microsoft, and don't bother me about it. Service checks has been extended. There is a built-in NRP client, so if you want to run from Windows, you can do that now. And the good thing about this is this one actually supports SSL or TLS, which the regular stuff really doesn't, so please don't use it. Right, 043, out summer 2014, that was a couple of months ago. Notice the picture in the background. Yes, it didn't happen. So we're looking at winter 2014, maybe. I'll try to do the release candidate when I get home from this conference. But I've said that several times, pretty much since this summer. So we'll see what happens. Yes, so what does 043 bring us? Well, we have Linux packages, quality improvements, meaning that things should work better and not quite as flaky. REST support, of course, meaning that you can now use a modern protocol instead of NRP to do your checks if you're so inclined. The idea was that there was supposed to be bundled scripts to make monitoring easier. it's not going to be. But instead, you get an amazing web UI. And I mean amazing. I really regret when I sent in the call for papers for this conference, or responded to the call for papers, I guess. I didn't know because I hadn't written the web UI. Otherwise, I would have done a 45-minute presentation about the web UI. It's that amazing. Yes. So, last thing before I head to the real presentation is this one, which I usually throw in just sort of to try to make people not become angry at me when I'm not responding to questions or emails or something. Sometimes I am actually busy, and much of that is building Legos, which I sort of share with you on the slides here and there if you haven't noticed it. But we do have sponsoring, or we do accept sponsoring, we do accept donations, especially from the Norwegian guys. They tend to do unsanitary donations. For instance, yesterday at the bar, he gave me money. No idea. But that's the Norwegians for you. They apparently bathe in oil and gold. So, yes, support before I head on. There is actually real support now. I have like a ticketing system. It's in the cloud. Yeah, it's awesome. That's cool. So if you pay me money, I will still not respond to your emails. But they will be in a ticketing system, which is much, much better. A big thank you to my sponsors. Without them, I wouldn't be here. They actually pay for my flight, unless they don't know it. And now it's time for you to wake up if you have been napping, because now we're going to go to the actual presentation. So the first thing we're going to talk about, if the clicker thing is working, is bounds. And bounds is, for those that don't know, it's sort of where things start to go bad. And a good example is check disk. Probably most of you in here are using check disk. Anyone who is not using check disk? One guy in the back. Oh, yeah, the Zabbix guy. Yeah. Yeah. And Zabbix is not a Nagios-based monitoring solutions. You should actually have left a while back. But you're free to stay. You're free to stay if you pay for the beer tonight. That said, the normal thing we do when we do check disk is like minus V80 minus C90 or something like that, which makes pretty much no sense at all, really. Because what does this mean? Well, if you have a 1 gigabyte drive, it means that if you have less than 200 megabyte free, you get a warning. And if you have a 1 terabyte drive, you get about 219 gigabytes free. And if you work at Google, you get about 225,179 gigabytes free when you get your warning email. And if I had 225,000 gigabytes free, I wouldn't want the warning email, quite frankly. So the problem here is obviously slack, right? I mean, we have this wasted space, which we don't really want affecting our monitoring. What we are interested in is when something happens to the used space, right? So, Argus to the rescue, right? We can always customize these. So we end up having, 80% on our 1 gigabyte drive, and we end up with 98% on our 1 terabyte drive. And for the guys at Google, they can always try to put in 99.8%, but NSClient, for instance, does not support fractions. So they're kind of out of loss there. But there are, of course, other solutions, but the question is, can we do better? And yes, Matthias Kettner, the guy behind CheckMKey, came up with this magic thing, which really is magic. What he does is he sort of scales the 80% things with some scale thing. So essentially, you put in 80%, but if you work at Google, it will magically turn into 99.8% or something like that. I think it's kind of a nice technical workaround for the problem we had. But maybe we can do better. Maybe we can actually solve the problem instead of looking for technical workarounds. And this is a real problem that I encountered, or that the company I worked for had about a year ago. And I build the integrations. That's what I do. So in essence, regardless of what your SOA strategy is, or your REST API, whatever they're talking about, whatever a single integration is doing, it's reading a file and writing a file. There's no web services involved. Or sometimes you read a file, put it on a web service, throw it around a couple of systems, and then write a file at the other end. But that's the way it works. So we had an integration that read a file, and it archived the file, and then it wrote the file, right? And then some ops guy was sort of working with the firewall department or something like that. He accidentally broke something in the firewall. So what happened was that the integration read the file, it archived the file, And it said, oh, I can't write it. So what am I going to do? I'm smart. I'll write it back where I read it from, and I can check it a bit later. Thing was, they were polling every 5 minutes, or 30 seconds, sorry. And every time they failed to write the file, they started a chain of retry events, meaning that the graph looked something like this, that quite quickly the disk space went through the roof, right? So what happened was that about an hour or something later, we had a problem. Then an hour later, we hit the warning threshold, which was quite high, and we got the first alert. But this was 3 o'clock at night, so we didn't send them out because we didn't want to wake up the on-call staff for warnings. So we waited a bit more, got the critical alert, and then things went really bad. Because once the MFT solution runs out of disk, it means that all your integrations, which are generally running at night, fail to write their files, and things just go to hell. The problem here is, of course, that we lost a lot of time before we got this information that things were breaking. And the on-call guy, he had about 5 minutes before he got his SMS to go to his computer, log in, open up the VPN thing, try to get that to work, and then get some key back through the SMS. Essentially, it takes about 10 minutes just to get in, right? So the question is, could we have done something differently to get this error much, much sooner? And actually, we could have, because if we sort of looked at the problem we're actually trying to solve, it's not, is the disk full? It's actually, is the disk utilization changing in an uncontrolled fashion? So had we been looking at the trend line, for instance, instead, we would quite quickly have noticed that, oh, things happened because the trend line started to shift, right? And quite quickly, we would have kind of been able to send out the first alert because things have changed. And then quite soon after that, we realized that it's even worse, right? And we could have got the on-call staff. And all of a sudden, he would have time to fix the problem. And the problem with this, when we're sort of monitoring thresholds just arbitrarily set at the value, is that we're not really monitoring anything. We just have thresholds and pretend we have monitoring. All this space which we're having would be wasted. But if we instead can use that space as a buffer, for instance, for the disk not to be full, and have monitoring on what we're actually looking for, it would be much better. But more importantly, it will solve the slack problem we had before, right? Because all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. What we're monitoring is when the disk utilization changes in an uncontrolled fashion, right? So, is this magic, you're asking? No, it sort of works with pretty much everything, and it's just pretty simple to implement, right? I mean, analyzing a graph isn't rocket science, it's math, right? Anyone who's been to basic school can do it. So, let's move on by looking at a completely different problem, and let's forget everything we've heard up until now. So, what about capacity planning? Sometimes we want to know when the disk is full so we can buy a new one. And bounds to the rescue, right? But using bounds for capacity planning is a bit like having an alarm clock set at some random time at night and hopefully wake up in time for work. It doesn't really make sense, right? Because we just want to wake up when we need it, not at some random arbitrary time. And the reason why it's random arbitrary is if you have a disk filling up at we have like the warning, sorry, some random arbitrary angle like this, and you set the warning threshold to 80% or whatever you think makes sense, you don't really know how long it will take for the disk to be full. And if you have another disk drive, it will be a completely different time period until it's full. So it doesn't really make sense. And it's quite easy to just sort of calculate when it's going to be full and just say, warn me if it's full in less than X weeks. And all of a sudden it works regardless of your disk size and how much it fills up and all that kind of stuff. It's not rocket science, it's basic math, right? And all of a sudden we've turned this alarm clock into 2 hours before work, which makes sense for probably most people, right? At least if you need 2 hours to get to work. Interestingly enough, if we would have used this paradigm or this way to monitor, all of a sudden the previous problem we had before would also have been covered, right? Because the trend line, or when the disk is full, would quite quickly have shifted when the trend line shifted, right? So we would quite easily have seen that, ooh, it's going to be full in like 3 weeks. And then a bit sooner, we would have noticed that, oh, it's going to be full in 5 minutes. Let's call someone. This is a problem. And the thing here is that we haven't really changed anything. We've just sort of flipped the value around the axis and made something that works probably a lot better in many scenarios. So is this magic then? And no, it's still basic math, right? I mean, anyone can do the calculus for this. Yes, with that, we're going to move away from our good friend check disk and move back to our good friend check disk. Does anyone know what a context is? No. Well, let me give you a couple examples. For instance, this morning my context was slightly hungover. And last week my context was, oh shit, I haven't finished my slides. And tomorrow my context will probably be, oh God, I'm so hungover. How am I going to get the first session? And that's what the context is. It's sort of what defines me. And usually you sort of know what the context is. And if we return to check disk and look at another problem, and this is sort of forcing it, but I like to use check disk at a lot of places. So probably a better one is disk I or something like that. But anyway, what we have is we have a check that runs fine, but then at some point of time, things change. In this case, this is a real example. And we have a Git server where we store all our source code, and then at night we have to spool all the Git repositories to a disk for the backup people to bring it up right. And what happens is that we almost fill up the disk because they're so cheap, so we just get 20 gigabytes. It's insane. I mean, 20 gigabytes. I have a USB stick that's bigger than that. But that's what we get. And what happens is that we almost fill the disk up, so we kept every night at 9 o'clock, we triggered their warning, which they had that 80% for the disk. And they just solved it by turning off the warning, because that's the solution they have. But the thing is, had we been able to define in our check somehow that now it's a bit different, we need to have different bounds, we need to have different values for this. During this time period, all of a sudden we could have made this much, much nicer. The problem is, if you're using something like Nagios, you can't. It's impossible. What you can do is you can set up two different checks and sort of say, yeah, these are the same, but they have different names, different graphs, and different everything. Which is not really a pretty solution. It's kind of a clunky solution, right? But what if we had context? So what if we could, when we defined our thresholds, just say, warn if the usage is above 80% and we're not running the backup. Or perhaps, and we're not running the backup and the disk is above 90%. I think this would actually change a lot of things, and it would make a lot of false positives go away, because things with computers are that, especially in an enterprise environment, is that at night, for instance, things changes a lot. We go from servicing customer to servicing various data application that want to do completely different things. So monitoring really needs to have a context for it to make sense, I think. So is this magic then, to return to the eternal question? And I would say no, it's pretty much tags. And we started the conference with like #OSMC. It wouldn't be much more different to implement this as a feature in, for instance, Nagios or something like that. So I think this is really something that should be there. Yes, now the clicker is not working as always. So metrics, take one. So there will maybe a follow-up a bit later. Metrics is something which people tend to collect, and as we just learned, apparently 3 or 4 times, because we want to have different programs looking at them. But a simple thing like check load, where we have a warning and a critical threshold, which on numbers I've never been able to comprehend. Someone once said that the load system on Unix is sort of like if you have a higher value than the number of cores, it's probably bad. But there seemed to be no real rationale behind these values. I like the Windows way better, where there's a percentage. I can relate to that much more easily. 100% is always bad. But the big question is, of course, what is bad CPU load? And please, hands up anyone who thinks 80% is bad. There's like 3 guys in the back. I wonder if 90%? There's like 1 guy. Interesting. Don't get ahead of me. Don't get ahead of me. 100%. And just a control question, 0%. Yes. Exactly. And that's really the point. It's just throw the box away. We're not using it right. I mean, a lot of these metrics are just there because we always do them, or because it's easy to do them, not because there is an actual business requirement for them. And if we were to look at load over time, if the clicker is working again, yeah, now it seems to be working, we could probably quite easily sort of compare it to yesterday's load. And the load from last week or the average from last week, and kind of quite easily figure out why it's wrong, and just tell it, you know, somehow it's different than what it used to be, and it's probably something we need to look into. But that's not really the way that most check load plugins work, right? And then is this magic? And no, it's still math, right? But we need to do a slightly bit different math. And the last thing, I think, I don't really know my slides that well, is correlation. And correlation is when you have several metrics which you sort of want to look at together. And this is sort of what they were aiming for before or something like that, I guess. It's when is the CPU bad? Is high CPU load a problem? If the clickety thing works. Is it good with high CPU load, or is it bad? Or maybe we don't even care about it. And if you ask me, I think high CPU load is actually good, because it means we're getting something from the hardware we bought. If we have a low CPU load, we can just, you know, rent out the server to someone else who want to use it. But that's just me personally. But the thing is, we need to somehow ask ourselves the question, why do we need to monitor this metric? Why is it important? And the clickety thing. Yeah. So with correlation, we can look at different values together. And if we have a high load and a low transaction count, it means that we're probably not doing too well, right? Or if the queues are not picking up messages or something like that, that will probably impact the decision. And the values together is really what sort of paints the picture and tells us that something is wrong here. So an individual metric isn't really the answer. It is the combined metrics that are the answer. And again, this is sort of not the way that things tend to work in the Nagios community. So is this magic then? No, we're still talking about math, right? And it's not even advanced math, it is basic math. So let's look at other metrics, because check CPU is all the rave, right? But then we have something like check memory, which I don't really know if you have percentage bounds on it. I, quite honestly, haven't used it. But the question here is, what is bad memory? I mean, is 80% bad? Or 90%? Or is it 100%? Or maybe, to do the control question, 0%? And the question here is not really which percentage is bad. The bigger question is, how many in here are using some sort of managed environment? And I'm not talking VMware, I'm talking things like Java, for instance. And if you're using Java, check memory is completely pointless. It tells you absolutely nothing. Or if you're using something which is based on the JVM, like Scala and all these new fancy languages like. But it's the same thing with a lot of other things. .NET, for instance, you have the same problem if you're running Ruby or Python or pretty much any language that we're using today, except for maybe C++ or C. But most of these languages we use today to build our enterprise applications are actually managed. And it means that a lot of the system metrics which we use has no impact whatsoever, because the memory is managed by the virtual machine. And all the metrics we need to be gathered from the machine we're running. Or sorry, not the Java virtual machine. So in essence, check memory is probably for most people completely pointless. A better thing is maybe check counter, where we can actually talk to our applications if we're running Windows, or JMX, or VMI, or whatever application server allows us to talk to it, right? But a lot of all these core metrics which we're using is completely pointless. And sort of to go back to where we started, check disk, which is my favorite check of the talk. What is a full disk? Is it good? Hands up, anyone who thinks a full disk is good. Yes, that's the answer. It depends a lot on what kind of application you're running, right? Because a lot of applications, they will fill up your disk, and then they will fill up the next disk, and they will fill up the third disk. Or if it's some sort of caching application that's using your SSD disk to speed up caching or to reduce the amount of RAM you're using something, they will just fill it up and be happy with it. So somewhere there needs to be a business argument for doing monitoring. We shouldn't just, okay, we have a new machine, let's slap on check memory, check disk, and check CPU. Happy, it's monitored. Awesome. Let's move about our business. So what I'm saying is that just because we can do something doesn't mean it's a sensible thing to do. A bit like selling fireworks on the street. Maybe not the smartest move, right? But we can do it, and we'll probably make some money along the way. But the answer is, of course, the question is, of course, why do we monitor? Is it because we can, or is it because we do, or is it some other because? And it should really not be that. It should be something completely different, because it's the business that should drive the monitoring, not the technology. And if you don't trust me on this, a prominent open source vendor who was trying to pitch their BPM stack to us, they didn't have this as a slide, but they sort of drew it on the flipboard, right? So in essence, what they said was that they had a big footprint in the IT industry and a very small footprint in the business industry, or in the business side. And if you look at the money, it goes the other way around. So it means that if you want to make money off of monitoring, you should probably be focusing up here and not down here. And the thing is, the guys who are building these kind of systems, they actually need monitoring. And they don't use Nagios, because they go and they buy some expensive solution which does nothing really. And then they sit there and say, oh, we have this expensive monitoring solution. We have no idea what it does, but it's awesome. And this is actually a true example, because I was working for a large pharmaceutical chain in Sweden, and they had a company come in and do a POC on a monitoring solution. It took about 6 months, and then they said, oh, look at all the problems you're having. And they were like, no, it's working fine. No, look here, it's like problem, 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 problem. No, it's working fine. The business is working fine. We don't care about your reports. They're wrong. And then they asked the question, so what does this value mean? And I was like, we have no idea. Well, this shows that the GVM is doing something which obviously is bad, but they couldn't explain why the business was affected. So monitoring really has to come from the business and the guys who develop the business tools, so that you can see that the business here is affected by the monitoring. And a good example of this is if you have a box where the hard drive is almost falling off, 2 hard drives have failed, one of the memory is giving you a CRC error, but the business is still running, that machine is in an okay state. It might not be for long, but it is currently in an okay state, because the business is functioning. We don't care about the technology, as long as the business is running. So, oh yeah, the clicker thing, it works if I click often, but not when I don't. So is this magic then? Well, no, I think it's common sense. So this sort of brings us to the question of why we do this, or why, yeah, the clicker thing is it's not really working all the time. Why we do monitoring wrong. And this is sort of where we enter the happy room, where there are no balloons and pets allowed, right? So welcome into the happy room. And at least my experience is that we do this because it's easy. It's much, much easier to just say, yeah, this is the way we do it. We have this Puppet template thing, we just throw it on, awesome, monitoring, done. And we also do it because it's simple. We don't have to care about the business. We don't need to figure out what all this stuff means. We can just get our alerts and say, hey, we're monitoring it. And once something goes haywire and doesn't work, we can say, no, we didn't have monitoring for that metric, sorry. And when someone comes and tells you, yeah, we want monitoring for this metric, you'll just say, no, it's not the way we do it. Because it's simple. You don't need to do anything. You can just install the magic monitoring box, throw on a couple of metrics, and it's all green until after about 2 weeks, when it's half yellow and mostly red. And that's pretty much the way it will stay, right? And I also think it's because what we always have been doing, because this is the way it works. And this sort of gets down to the problem here is Nagios, notice the trademark, by the way, is old. And we can't really get away from the fact that Nagios is old. It's not the latest. It's not the next big thing. It's not even the last big thing. It's like the really old dinosaur that no one knows how to kill. And of course, there is a lot of add-ons for Nagios that can do this. And we can sort of plug in all sorts of cool stuff and maybe get something that does this. And one of them that does a lot of cool stuff like this is BizCheck. There's a whole bunch of Nagios forks that sort of pretends to do all this new stuff. And of course, then there's this whole, the new stuff, all these weird solutions that's just magic boxes which you connect through. I have no idea, but it's like 4 million applications which together make up awesome monitoring things. And of course, there's other solutions, things like, to some degree, Zabbix and the other tools around there. But why should we need that? I mean, why do we need to have a tool? Why do I need to have an add-on? Nagios could do this. Again, notice the trademark, no infringement intended. But somehow we need to fast forward Nagios 15 years into the future, because right now it's not really there, right? And maybe, you know, Nagios is not the way to go. Maybe it's Niemann, again, notice the trademark, no infringement intended, that will be able to do this. I don't know, but we need something that can do it. Because I don't want to go to my client and say, hey, you know, I'm going to spend the next 4 years installing this awesome monitoring thing, and maybe in 4 years it will be done and working. I don't know. I need to go to my client and say, hey, next week we're going to install this thing, and it's going to work from day one. And essentially, I mean, if you look at Nagios, what is it? Well, it has a scheduler. We could call it cron. And you can add service checks, and they could look a bit like this. And then you could have a little shell script that sort of runs the service check for you, checks the exit status, and sends you an email if it's bad, right? And this is pretty much what Nagios does. And this was really, really cool 15 years ago. And here's something else that was cool 15 years ago. And I don't know, but I wouldn't call this cool today. And the whole thing with Nagios, it's a bit like Ethan said in 2008. Nagios is feature complete. Everything else can sort of be built on top of it. And yes, sort of. I mean, if I have a bike and keep looking at all the guys with their cars, I'd be like, awesome. I also want to have 4 wheels. So I go and buy another bike, weld them together, and it's like, yeah, I have a car, awesome. So I go out there, and then it's a bit like, oh, damn, I have no back seat. So I go grab a park bench, weld that on, and it's like, oh, sweet. Then I get to an uphill, and it's like, oh, this is really heavy. So I go weld on an engine in front, and then it starts to rain, right? But no matter how much stuff I keep adding, it will not turn into a car. That's the sad part of it, right? You know, it is a bike we're having, but we want the car. So somehow, if we sort of look at this again, why are we sort of talking about this? Why is this a problem? And the reason is that these are not answers. I'm not telling you we should have this. I'm not saying that check disk should check it this way or anything like that. What I'm saying is these are questions. Why doesn't it work like this? Why can't I do graph analysis inside Nagios and have it do trend line analysis and all those kind of things? I mean, this is essentially a cry for help, because this is what I need. And I could probably build this with a lot of tools and stuff around it, but I don't have the time and I don't have the inclination to do it. So of course this is sort of when NSClient creeps back into the picture, right? Because 044, which will be out in spring 2015, by the way, again, notice the picture. I would like to do a lot of these stuff, but there's a lot of stuff I can't do. I mean, I could maybe do some sort of trend analysis by keeping a couple of historical values or something like that. I mean, there's no practical way to do history analysis or anything like that. That has to be done with Nagios. There has to be a way for me to query all this information from Nagios to be able to do it, or, you know, whatever backend Nagios is using. Same thing with correlation. I mean, if an agent is running over here and it needs to correlate data with something over here, it's not possible to do it unless you're building some weird, cool infrastructure around it. Context could probably be added without much trouble, but then you would have to administrate them over on the client side, and that's kind of clunky, right? You probably want to have that centrally. And there is a whole bunch of these things which Nagios cannot deliver currently, unfortunately. And the answer, I don't think, is, you know, yeah, we're going to do a new fork, and we're going to call it, as we said last night, Bacon, which was a recursive acronym for Bacon's not a fork of Nagios, or something like that, a clone of Nagios, sorry. And I don't think that's the answer. I think we need to rethink it. I think we need to take Nagios and go away with the whole yes or no mentality. We need to have the whole metrics stream flowing, and we need to do the filtering. But we need to do it in the way we do it in Nagios, where we can add a host, and we can add services, and we can set thresholds on them. Because that way, at least I relate to information. I mean, going all the way over on this side, where you just have magic values and things, I could never do that. And I could never really sell that, because I think it's too difficult. But somewhere we need to get there, and so I'm sort of asking for your help, really, you know, because we need to change the way Nagios works. And with that, I want to say thank you. And just briefly, before I say thank you, And I'm way under time, by the way. That sucks. Do you remember the amazing... Whoa, I'm losing my microphone. The amazing web UI, right? I'm just going to give you a slight teaser. I mean, look at this guy. When you're typing your checks, you get like auto-completion with context help. Take that, Nagios. And with that, unfortunately, a bit too early, I will say thank you for real. And please, any questions? And this is your cue to ask questions if you didn't notice. Yes, there is a question already. I'm going to do this photo thing while he sort of pretend that there are people actually asking questions. Yeah, and he's standing up as well. That's like...
So can I ask a question now?
Yes, yes, please ask, you know.
So you just mentioned very, very tiny that you actually did some security improvements. So you mentioned SSL.
Yes.
So when I looked last time at NSClient I or like some preview version, like it was maybe 2 years ago, I thought, okay, that will be really great, but security is still not solved. So, and I read your blog entry. Actually, I referenced that in my talk.
Yeah.
So what have you done to fix security? What have you done to fix SSL, which is completely broken in NRP?
Well, essentially, we can have certificate-based authentication.
Yeah, which is a big thing. So
Yeah.
not for the data part.
And that's pretty much it. In 043, it is the default. So this means that if you install NSClient, it will generate a certificate for you, and it will be able to not validate them by default, because then you would have to have like a central CA or something like that. But you can definitely do that. So if you have and you issue certificates for your machine, you can absolutely use them, and you can use real SSL.
Okay, so basically it's still the solution you offered 2 years ago on your blog.
Yes.
So, but it's not properly documented at the NSClient wiki, because I looked through that a couple of days ago and said, yeah, sure, it's sort of in there, but
Yeah,
what?
yeah. But I do accept pull requests. No, yeah, I know. But it will be much easier to do it with 043, because then when you set up NSClient, you will be able to select if you want to use certificates or not. But it's still the authentication bit you need to solve elsewhere, so that's not really fixed. But at least you will have real certificates and real encryption, not the ADH thing that they're using in the previous one. But the problem is, of course, that it means that check NRP on Linux will stop working. So you have to use NSClient on Linux as well. But we have packages for that, hopefully, maybe someday. Yeah, well, the packages are there, actually. So I think I'm building them. It's just that I'm not putting them somewhere. But I'm not a package guy. So if someone knows how to do proper packaging, feel free to drop me an email or something. Because I could send you the way they look, but I don't know if the way they should look. So, other questions? You know, they won't let me come next year if I finish like 15 minutes early. So we have to do questions for at least 5 minutes.
You're talking too quick.
Yeah.
Too fast.
Can you compare your system with Skyline and Oculus?
With?
With Skyline and Oculus, it's the same system that tries to get a trend and give some alert.
Well, first of all, I'm not talking about a solution, so this doesn't really exist. But what I don't want is I don't want to have Etsy Skyline or whatever. I want to have Nagios, and I want that functionality to be in Nagios. And then maybe you want to have some add-on that does it better. But Nagios out of the box should provide the functionality. That is sort of my pitch. So in essence, this is just a huge Nagios bashing. So, other questions? No?
Yeah. Thank you, Mike.
Yes. Maybe, if you come up to me later.
Tonight at Checkpoint Jenny.
Yeah. After Checkpoint Jenny, there will be a lot of stuff happening. Seriously, no questions. Yeah, that sucks to be me. Well, that's the way it is. Thank you for listening, anyway.
So we will have a slightly longer coffee break until 12 a.m. And in case you're wondering, your lunch break is at 1 p.m. So there's still a talk here. And it will be Andreas Eriksson.